Hello my loves, and welcome back to my channel. It is finally time for the finale to two eyeshadow palette panning projects that I was working on last year. My Pan That palette, or Pan Those palettes, because I was working on two palettes, and also Project Level Up. If you forgot that I was working on Project Level Up, no worries, because I kind of forgot too. But I am here today to finish off these projects. I'm going to share my usage with you and also chat with you a little bit about my plans for working on my eyeshadow palettes in 2025. So if that sounds good, I hope you will stick around. There's a bit of a wild and crazy story coming your way when it comes to my Pan That palette, so buckle your seatbelts for that, and let's just get into it. So last year I was working on the Pantastic Ladies prompt for the year, which was a fun size palette, and then I also added an additional palette into the project using the Better Together prompt. I will have the Pantastic Ladies Facebook group linked down below, along with the creators of both of the project prompts. For the fun-sized prompt, I was working on my Wet n Wild My Glamour Squad eyeshadow palette, and for the Better Together prompt, I was working on my Smashbox Cover Shot Major Metals palette, which was also pretty small, so it also was kind of a fun-sized palette, but had a very similar color story. Here's where things get a little bit complicated. I actually don't have my Wet n Wild palette to show you. Here's what happened. So around December 20th of last year, I still had two pans left to hit on the palette, and I thought to myself, you know what, I'm just gonna bring this palette with me while I was traveling down to my parents' house for the holidays. And previously I had not traveled with this palette because the lid was broken and I knew there was a really good chance that the palette would break and the shades would get all over the place. But I thought, you know what, I really want to hit these last two pans, so I put it in my travel makeup bag. My husband and I were in the car about to have a really long car trip, and a lot of times if I'm on a car trip, I'll do my makeup to pass the time, and also so that I don't have to get up extra early to do it in the morning. The lid of the palette, of course, had fallen off in my makeup bag and cut into the shades in the palette, and so there was eyeshadow absolutely everywhere. So I had a really bright idea. I thought, I'll just roll down the window a little bit and I will dust off the shadow that has collected on this palette. On the highway. You can probably see where this is going. Clearly, I misjudged the weight of the palette and the wind took it right out of my hand and the palette was no more. Can't believe I'm sharing this on the internet because it makes me look like an idiot. Yeah, not my brightest moment, not my brightest idea. I basically threw my Pan That palette out the window. Aside from just feeling like a total dum-dum, I'm also really sad that I littered. I have never littered in my life, and I'm honestly like very upset about that. Aside from the very unfortunate way in which the palette and I have parted, I was planning on decluttering the palette at the end of the year anyway. I'm just taking it as a sign that the fates were like, listen, enough is enough. We are taking this palette physically out of your hands. I cannot believe I did that. So needless to say, my Pan That palette finale is a little bit sad because I don't have the palette physically anymore. It is somewhere on the side of the road. Hopefully it hasn't harmed any moving vehicles or living creatures. I'd like to say accidents happen, but I've never heard of that happening to anyone else, so maybe these things just happen to me. I will report to you my usage using a photo from the last update so that at least you can know that I was making progress on the palette. I did still have two pans that I wanted to hit left by the end of the year, and I was gonna just try my best in those last 11 days of the year to get those pans hit. But in terms of the final numbers, I had 49 uses on the lightest transition shade, 16 uses on the Champagne Gold shimmer shade, which I also used to franken, which I'll show you in a minute, 10 uses on the yellow gold shimmer shade, 15 uses on the burgundy matte, 50 uses on the black matte, which is one of the shades that I was still trying to hit a pan on at the end of the year, 9 uses on the rose shimmer shade, which I also used to franken a shade that I will show you, 14 uses on the plum shimmer shade, 52 uses on the rust orange matte, which was the other shade that I was still working to get pan on before I threw it out the window. 18 uses on the neutral brown matte and 57 uses on the deepest brown matte shade. So those are the final numbers that I have to report to you on my Pan That palette. My original goal was to hit pan in every shade, and I got pretty close. I still had those 2 pans left that I was really, really close to hitting pan on, but the universe had other plans for that palette this time. My Better Together palette thankfully was safe and sound here at home and did not make the trip with me in the car to meet its unfortunate end. I was working on my Smashbox Cover Shot Major Metals palette, so I will show you what this palette was looking like at the last update, and then I will show you what it's looking like today. I used the shade Chandelier 18 times. I used the shade Ignited 3 times. The shade Out of This World I used 5 times. The shade Heat Index I used 6 times. Rose Plated I used 8 times. Go Platinum I used 4 times. Social Currency I used 6 times. And Garnet All I used 5 times. So my goal for this palette was not necessarily to hit pan in every shade. I just wanted to get more use out of it because it is my oldest palette in my collection, and I had a really hard time forcing myself to use this palette, even though it made total sense as a pairing with the Wet n Wild palette in terms of the color story. I, as you can see from the numbers, just really did not feel drawn to this palette, and for that reason, I'm actually going to be decluttering this. If I'm having that difficult of a time forcing myself to use this, even when it's in a project where it makes total sense to use it, I don't think that it's a palette that I need in my collection, and it is my oldest palette. I received this as a birthday gift, I believe, in 2017. So I'm honestly not too sad about letting it go. I feel like it's just not serving me at this point in my makeup journey anymore, which I guess in a way the Pan Those Palettes project did serve its purpose, because I used products in my collection that I wanted to try and use up, and I learned that I don't necessarily need them in my collection anymore. I mean, with the Wet n Wild palette, the decision was made for me, but with this one, it definitely just showed me that I don't need to hold on to this anymore. I have other shimmers in better, more flattering shades for me that I want to reach for more often, so we will be saying goodbye to the Smashbox Cover Shot Major Metals palette today. However, I will be holding on to my little Franken shade that I made with the Champagne Gold shimmer in the Wet n Wild palette, the Rose Gold shimmer in the Wet n Wild palette, and the lightest shade Chandelier from the Smashbox palette. This has actually served me pretty well as a nice inner corner shade. I used it 21 times and I hit pan on the 11th use. There's still a good amount of product in here, so I'm going to keep it kicking around for whenever I need a pretty easy champagne inner corner shade. And I'm glad that I ended up doing this, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have had as many pans as I did. Here is what this shade was looking like at the last update, and here is what it's looking like today. So all in all, kind of a weird year for Pan That palettes. 2024 was my 3rd year doing a Pan That palette. And to be honest, I've never really had that much success with the Pan That palette project. For 2025, I'm going to be taking a break from Pan That palette, and that is for a few key reasons. Buddy, what are we doing? Come here. We have a clingy baby on our hands, so this is what we're just going to be dealing with for the next minute or so. But first of all, I just did a palette declutter not all that long ago, and I feel like my palette collection is fairly new. And I know a lot of people, when they start a Pan That palette, they go for palettes that already have a good amount of use. And I feel like for me, I just don't have a lot of palettes that have a ton of use right now. I really need to work on showing love to all my palettes and really getting to know my palette collection. I'm also on a no-buy this year, so I really want to give myself lots of variety so that I don't get bored and feel tempted to shop. I think it's going to be a really important year for me to shop my stash and fall in love with what I have and get inspired by what I have. So I don't want to set myself up for temptation on my no-buy by making myself feel like I have to use certain palettes. I want to keep things a little bit more free-flowing so that my inspiration can be free-flowing and hopefully my no-buy can be a success. And I'm also just interested in seeing what I organically reach for and I'm using without having the guidelines of a pan that palette. So for me in 2025, I'm gonna try to get a really realistic depiction of what palettes I am reaching for, what palettes I feel inspired by and really want to use. I'm going to be tracking those palettes and also the amount of times that I use them in the year. So instead of a formal pan that palette or a palette panning project, I think I'm going to do something more like what my friend Lynn does on her channel, which is a monthly palette roundup. I will have her channel and those videos linked down below. Or potentially a monthly palette ranking by usage type video, which I know Sofie Alexandra does. Again, I'll have her linked. You all will have to let me know in the comments down below which of those options you would like to see the most, or if there's a third option that you would find helpful to see what palettes I'm using month to month as well as my usage on them. So yeah, no pan that palette in 2025. I'm sorry if that disappoints some of you who really wanted to see me do that project, but I think at this moment in time for my life and for my no-buy and for my current makeup collection, it just makes the most sense for me to put a hold on that project. It doesn't mean I'll never come back to it and do a pan that palette in the future, but I'm just taking a break from it for now. However, if you are doing a pan that palette, please let us know that in the comments down below, because even though I'm not doing the project this year, I still absolutely love watching the update videos and getting lots of motivation from them. So I would love to follow along with your pan that palette journey. Switching gears now to talk about Project Level Up, which is a project created by Sofie Alexandra, who again I will have linked in my description box. Such a fun, innovative, and cool project. I think especially for people who again have a lot of usage on a lot of their palettes or who are just really good panners. I am learning that I am a very slow panner. So I was already adapting the Project Level Up rules to fit my kind of pace. I was doing a light version of the project. So basically there are 5 levels, and on each level you have a certain amount of pans to hit. So level 1, you're supposed to use every shade 1 time and hit 1 pan. Level 2, use every shade 2 times and hit 2 pans, and so on and so forth. I already knew I wasn't going to be able to achieve that, so I modified it to a more usage style project in line with what I had seen some other people do. So instead of hitting pans, I set a usage goal of 10 uses on my focus shades. So for level 1 at the beginning of 2024, I was working on my Natasha Denona Sunrise palette, and that went really, really well. I flew through the 1 uses on every shade and I hit my focus goal of 10 uses on one of those shades pretty quickly, and I was still feeling very motivated. Level 2 went great because I randomly pulled my Natasha Denona Mini Gold palette, which the size of the palette I'm learning makes a huge difference in Project Level Up, and if I had kind of kept that in mind and vetoed some of my huge palettes, I might have had more success last year. Level 3 is where things got a little bit dicey for me because I randomly rolled in my ABH Norvina Pro Palette Volume 4. This is a huge palette, and I think that's where I really started to lose motivation with this project and get a little bit discouraged. I will show you what the palette was looking like when I rolled it in. Very pinky purpley color story in this palette. A few different types of formulas. There's mattes, there's shimmers, and there's also some more chunky glittery shades. I've had quite a few kind of disasters with this palette. I don't know if it was just my luck last year or what, but I'm obviously having some struggles with keeping my palettes intact. When I received this palette as a hand-me-down from my friend Liz, I was so excited to get it. Unfortunately, in transit, a few of the shades did shatter, and I did my best to repress them. I just think that my repressing was not enough to keep the shades together, and the formula also probably changed when I did all of that repressing. And so some of these shades turned out to be really, really crumbly and shatter very easily multiple times. A lot of them, the formula actually changed in terms of like the performance of the shade. There are a few shades in here that I ended up having a really hard time getting an even coating of the pigment on my eyelids, and I just think that this palette has kind of been through it, and I've also been through it with this palette. I will update you on the usage of each shade just so you know that I did give it a good college try for level 3. A1 I used 2 times, A2 I used 3 times, A3 I used 3 times, A4 was one of the focus shades that I picked and I was able to use it the full 10 times. A5 was another focus shade and I only used it 5 times. I think quite a bit of this shade ended up falling out. Same goes with B1. This shade continued to crumble and shatter all over the palette and fall out, but I did manage to use it 3 times. B2 I used 3 times. B3 I used 3 times. B4 I used once. B5 I used 3 times. C1 I used 4 times, and this was one of the shades that the performance of the pigment just was really not there, and I had a really hard time getting an even application on my eyes. C2 I used twice. C3 I used twice. That was another one of those shimmer shades that ended up just not really working anymore. C4 I used 3 times. C5 I used once. D1 I used 3 times. D2 I used once. D3 I used 4 times. D4 I used twice. D5 I used 3 times. E2 I used once and I put it on my eyes, which I promised myself I would not do, and I immediately regretted it because it got into my eye and it felt scratchy, and I wear contacts and it got behind the contact and it could have been a whole event. Thankfully, my eyes were okay, but yeah, I am just not a big fan of putting pressed glitters on my eyes. I knew that going into it, but I figured I would try it again and definitely regretted it. So I ended up not using E3 at all. E4 was my 3rd focus shade. I was supposed to use 10 times and I used it 5, and E5 I used once. So I did attempt level 3 on this palette, but it was a struggle from the start, and I just think that this is a palette that makes me not want to use this palette. It is so hard to work with now, and there's just always the threat of it shattering and making a huge mess. So I think I'm gonna declutter this one too. I know. 3 palettes out of my collection gone just from these projects, but the reality is I have so many palettes that it's a joy to use, that I want to use, that don't fall all over the place, that don't irritate my eyes. Why am I forcing myself to use a palette that I don't enjoy? You know what I mean? But if I hadn't tried to do level 3 of Project Level Up with this palette, I probably wouldn't have known that. So I learned a lot about myself, my eyeshadow preferences, and also the state of this palette, and I feel okay to get rid of it. So I'm not going to be continuing with Project Level Up in 2025. Again, I love the project. I think it's so fun. I love watching other people do the project. Just for me right now, I kind of just want to play. I just want to have freedom to use whatever I want, whenever I want, and I will be recording that to share with you on a monthly basis. But hopefully you all understand where I'm coming from with my current relationship to my palettes and my decision to not continue with these projects in 2025. I'm trying to focus on the positive, that even though I didn't really meet my goals for panning in my eyeshadow palettes last year, I still had a lot of fun with it, and I still got a lot of use on palettes that might not have gotten that much use otherwise. But I'm also ready for a fresh start in 2025, and I really authentically do look forward to seeing what I use and reach for when I have no projects, no rules, no parameters. Once again, if you are doing Project Level Up or any other kind of eyeshadow panning project, please let us know that in the comments down below, because I love watching palette panning content and I hope to be like you someday. But this year for me, is not going to be the year. Which is not to say that I won't be hitting pans. I've actually already hit an eyeshadow pan, which is actually kind of wild because as I'm filming this, it's only the second week of January. So I will make sure to share any eyeshadow pans that I do hit with you in my monthly updates. And I hope that at least some of you will stick around and follow along, even though I am doing things a little bit differently this year. If you are interested in seeing what eyeshadow palettes get the most organic use from me in 2025, I would love it if you would subscribe to keep up with my update videos and give the video a like out of respect for the Wet n Wild My Glamour Squad palette, which didn't deserve the unfortunate end that it got. Thank you so much for watching today and for bearing with me as I am just feeling out my journey with makeup and with panning and honestly with YouTube, the kind of content that I want to make. I appreciate each and every one of you so much, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!